And I must say that this saying is not true, which teaches that when a lover is at the hand of a not-lover should be more favored, because the lover is insane and the other sane. For if it were a simple fact that insanity is an evil, the saying would be true. But in reality, the greatest of blessings come to us through madness, when it is sent as a gift of the gods. Mania is a word with many definitions in English. Depending on your life's experiences and those you spend time with, it might mean a specific swing in bipolar folks that causes frenzied activity, productivity, mood highs, and obsession, sometimes also irritability and insomnia. To others, it can mean a shared obsession for a group of people, like Beatles mania or Star Trek mania. To others, it simply means obsessions and heightened moods that hint at some kind of mental instability. This video is about none of those things. I'm going to be talking about the divinely induced state of mania, spelled the same way but indicating something a bit different, specifically in aspects that some of the ancients considered blessings. Future videos will cover tragic madness in its entirety, but for this week, I want to explore a concept many in the Hellenist community may be only passingly familiar with. Let's get into it. Kairete. Before we start, I want to make this clear. I am not talking specifically about mental illness in this video, bipolar symptoms, or anything of the sort. Nor, when I get into the Korobontic rites and other ancient treatments in future videos, am I endorsing them as effective treatments to replace modern scientific treatments or therapies, or suggesting that people not get mental health help for their symptoms. Though these states were considered divine in origin, and I do believe the gods interact with us in these ways to this day, that does not mean that you shouldn't seek help if you experience mental states like those I'm about to describe to the detriment of your daily life and experience. Even in ancient times, everything I'm about to describe was equal parts blessing and curse, and it can be a very fine line between religious experience and mental illness. I also understand that what is considered mental illness varies by cultural norms, and many diagnoses in the DSM even to this day are politicized. As such, I want to stress, do not use religion and religious experience as an excuse not to seek help if you need it. Do not write off a potential monic state as divinely induced if it's causing problems for you. Modern science is also a blessing, and I can't imagine the gods wouldn't want you to get the help you need if you need it. Those divinely enhanced states will still be available to you if the gods choose to give them to you, even after you get help. It can be a very important way to distinguish what is divine from what is earthly and malfunctioning in your brain. Got it? Alright, with that out of the way, we've pretty clearly covered what the state isn't, so let's talk about what it is. Mania had many different terms it was related to, but for the purposes of this video, we'll be talking about those that were specifically God-induced, potentially for the benefit of the person receiving the state or those around them. Mania meant many things in ancient Greece, but at its most basic, it was an altered state of consciousness induced by a god that produced miraculous effects for the worshipper and or those around them. These included, but were not limited to, potentially healing themselves from illnesses or purifying a family line of blood guilt, inspired utterances, induced by either the nymphs or the Muses that were said to be the only state in which the greatest poetry, music, and plays could be composed, Prophetic Mania, which allowed the gods to speak messages directly to the population, Battlefield Mania that allowed for great feats of strength, Telestic or Initiatory Mania that opened up new avenues of knowledge and experience for those who were in the altered state, and the Mania of the Philosopher, which enabled great leaps of logic to be created. I'll be dividing this video into multiple segments to deal with each in turn within its own category, though some, such as nympholepsy and panolepsy, intersect and will be mentioned more than once. There were negative uses of the term as well, particularly dealing with tragic madness, but we'll save those for another video. For the purposes of this one, this is the definition we'll be using, and remember that miraculous does not always mean blessings, simply extremes that humans don't typically reach on our own without divine intervention. As we'll see, sometimes even those that would typically be considered blessings could become a curse when an addiction to the effects was instilled in the god's target, or exhaustion and slow drain of the health were induced through things like Prophetic Mania. Part 1. Prophetic Mania. The ancient Greek image of prophetic mania has built for itself quite the legacy in modern storytelling, especially in fantasy. When one thinks of prophecy, the first image that springs to mind is the crazed prophet, eyes wide and staring into a vision the audience before them cannot see, desperately trying to make sense of the images laid out by the gods for their benefit. Another common image of the Montic inspiration manifested in the priestesses of Dodona and Delphi, through whom Apollon was said to speak directly to the masses. I went over a number of reasons why the madness wasn't likely chemically induced in my video on divination generally, but it remains that these two priestesses stood as the peak of divinely inspired prophetic mania, so much so that even the curmudgeon Plato, using Socrates as a mouthpiece in the Phaedrus, names them as practitioners of the highest art and those who provide a needed service for mankind. Those of you who watched my video on divination may know that there is a special connection between the nymphs, Hermes, and Apollon related to divination established in the Homeric hymn to Hermes. Hermes himself was a child of the nymph Maia and Zeus, making him a half-brother to Apollon. After his adventures stealing Apollon's cattle, lying about it, and making up for it with the gift of the lyre, Hermes asks his half-brother about teaching him the art of divination. This is how he replies. "But as for soothsaying, noble, heaven-born child of which you ask, it is not lawful for you to learn it, nor for any other one of the deathless gods. Only the mind of Zeus knows that. I am pledged and have vowed and sworn a strong oath that no other of the eternal gods save I should know the wise-hearted counsel of Zeus. And do not you, my brother, bearer of the golden wand, bid me to tell those decrees which all-seeing Zeus intends. As for men, I will harm one and profit another, sorely perplexing the tribes of unenviable men. Whoever shall come guided by the call of flights of birds of sure omen, that man shall have advantage through my voice, and I will not deceive him. But whoso shall trust idly chatting birds, and shall seek to invoke my prophetic art contrary to my will, and to understand more than the eternal gods, I shall declare that he shall come on an idle journey, yet his gifts I would take. But I will tell you another thing, son of all-glorious Maia and Zeus who holds the aegis, luck-bringing genius of the gods. There are certain holy ones, sisters born, 3 virgins gifted with wings, their heads are besprinkled with white meal, and they dwell under a ridge of Parnassus. These are the teachers of divination apart from me, the art which I practiced while yet a boy following herds, though my father paid no heed to it. From their home they fly now here, now there, feeding on honeycomb and bringing all things to pass. And when they are inspired through eating yellow honey, they are willing to speak the truth, but be they deprived of the god's sweet food, then they speak falsely, as they swarm in and out together. These then I give you, inquire of them strictly and delight your heart, and if you should teach any mortal to do so, often will he hear your response, if he have good fortune. Take these, son of Maia, and tend the wild roving, horned oxen and horses and patient mules." The 3 maidens referred to here were likely the bee nymphs, either the Coryciae, the nymphs of the prophetic springs of Mount Parnassus, or the Themiids, the daughters of the goddess Themis. Nymphs in Greece were generally associated with springs, caves, rivers, and the wilds. Nearly every nymph who gave birth in the epics was said to have dwelled in a cavern or cave, especially around the hinterlands and the mountains, including Hermes' own nymph mother. We'll get into the prophetic qualities of certain springs and water sources we're said to have in a bit when we talk about the oracles at Delphi and Dodona, but suffice to say, the link between water, honey/bees, prophecies, nymphs, and Apollon runs deep in antiquity and has manifestations in cult. The bee nymphs taught Hermes divination by lots, thereby transferring it as a domain to him in the hymn, but the associations with the nymphs did not end at the myth itself. Apollon specifies that these bee nymphs would become inspired specifically when consuming honey, mirroring language around inspiration with prophecy used when discussing oracles given in a monic state. We don't have a lot of detail about what the state of inspiration felt like in the moment. Those that did the prophesying often had their prophecies recorded, so we know what sort of questions were asked and answers received, but the mental state of those prophesying remains in the dark to those of us seeking information in written sources to this day. What we do know, I'll go over to the best of my ability, but unless you've ever been granted a prophetic vision yourself or have participated in a still living tradition where seeking such as a part of practice, then this may be something difficult to directly understand without experiencing it. That said, in ancient times it's clear that for those who lived near the underground dwellings of the nymphs, should one take a fancy to them, it was possible to experience this state if only for a moment. All around Greece, various caves could be found that were said to be sacred to specific nymphs and were filled with votive offerings and astrogaloe, or knucklebone dice used for divination. Many of the most famous oracles of the Theoi had caverns and grottos attached as well, such as those found at Claros, Didyma, Dodona, Delphi, Hierapolis, Bura, Aegira, Olympia, Lycosaura, Ptoion, Lebedea, and Oropos. Some of the nymph claves were clearly cult sites that many paid pilgrimage to, leaving their gifts and throwing the bones for answers. The quality of the gifts left there shows that divination by lots was considered a less expensive form of divination. This was the divination of the common folks, at oracles written by those inspired by the frenzy of the nymphs. In later antiquity, books of lot oracles were sold individually by oracle mongers, but that never seemed to affect the popularity of the cult site caves. The divine influence of the nymphs still infused these places, at least for those that became cult sites. Some nymph cave sites were the work of individual devotions, either destined to become cult sites in the future as the works of Archidemos and Pantocles, while others appeared to be obsessive singular devotions by men driven mad by contact with their nymph consorts. Remember when I said the gifts of the gods didn't always stay blessings? This seizure of the senses by nymphs was known as nympholepsy, and it had many different aspects to it. It largely affected men, though women could be carried off as well. Accounts were much rarer. Nymphs, being between the deathless gods and mortal humans with their long lives but lack of true immortality, were said frequently to consort with mortals, and the experiences were said to create an internal ecstasy in their consorts that quickly became addictive. Those under the sway of nympholepsy could spontaneously burst into song, similar to poetic inspiration by the Muses, which we'll cover later, or verse, or could be struck by visions and prophecy. Some were inspired to create the lot oracles in the aforementioned caves so that others could pour a libation of honey at the entrance, roll the astragaloi, and receive blessings and wisdom of the nymphs and the sanctum their devotion built to their mistresses. Pantocles in particular showed a unique obsessive devotion in his inscriptions, referencing being seized by the divine inspiration of nymphs and blessed with Heracles' strength to move the stones around the cave's mouth to form the entrance, to tend the plants outside and keep the area clean for visitors. Several of his inscriptions are in hexameter, which is the meter of classic poetry and frequently considered a sign of divinely inspired poetry and divination. Pan was also honored in Pantocles' cave, as he was alongside many of the other nymph cults. Pan had his own form of divine mania, Panolepsy, which was said to be a direct possession by the god himself and elevating, as opposed to panic, which the god replaced all other human emotions in his target with fear. Apollodorus credits Pan as the teacher of prophecy to Apollon, though his account is much later than either the Homeric hymn or Hesiod's Theogony, which credit the gift of prophecy to Apollon directly by Zeus. In Arcadia, Pan was the chief oracular god rather than Apollon, and his chief oracle was in a cavern on Mount Lyceum. Similarly to Apollon and the nymphs, the evidence we have from Menander's play Dyskolos and the cavern it takes place in shows that Pan was believed to give his prophecies through possession directly. Panolepsy, then, is another manifestation of prophetic mania. Like Hermes, he had a nymph for a mother, and himself was said to be the son of Hermes in the Homeric hymn to Pan. That's two generations of nymphs plus a nymph trade dad if it isn't clear just how associated with the nymphs his very birth was. Pan is often portrayed accompanying Dionysos or chasing the nymphs, again connecting the deities said to bring on these manic states closely with one another, both in myth and in cult. In fact, nymphs has mothered or gifted their prophetic powers to many ancient mythological seers, such as Mupsus, son of Amphix, Edmon, Tiresias, and Epimenides. According to Pausanias, a Parnassian nymph named Daphnis was the first prophet of the former oracle of Gaia at Delphi before Apollon claimed it. Calypso was the nymph who captured Odysseus in the Odyssey and spoke prophecies to him while she kept him. Continuing the ties between Apollon prophecy and the nymphs, several inscriptions in nymphic caves give Apollon the epithet Nymphagetes, ruler of or companion to the nymphs, and many vase paintings and other images show Apollon, Hermes, and the nymphs together. Offerings of honey or honey cakes had to be given to Apollon, the nymphs, or Pan before the state of mania could begin in all of these instances, or, in the case of oracles at Claros of Dodona, water from a spring sacred to a nymph had to be consumed as part of the ritual to induce the manic state. Regardless, it was clear that in the Greek mind, one had to be out of their mind, manic, in order to prophesy directly, and all the gods which were said to induce this state had deeply intertwined cults and myths. While we're talking about Apollon and Mania, the much more well-known oracles in the Greek world at Delphi and Dodona work similarly, and the way they operate strengthens all of the associations between prophetic mania, the nymphs, Apollon, honey, water, and prophecy. These were held as the gold standard of divination by the rich folks who left us written records, like Plato, though the detail he goes into in his work and the detail that later authors such as Cicero, who continue to try and defend his positions, shows us that the belief that inspired divination was superior to lot divination may not have been a common one. Heck, the popularity of the aforementioned nymph cave oracles shows that alone. However, the fact that even the cynical Plato noticed the power and blessings and the mnemonic state given by Apollon to these prophetesses speaks volume of the esteem the oracles had in the Greek world. For the prophetesses at Delphi and the priestesses at Dodona, when they have been mad, have conferred many splendid benefits upon Greece in both private and public affairs, but few or none when they have been in their right minds. And if we should speak of the Sibyl and all the others by who prophetic inspiration have told many things to many persons and thereby made them fortunate afterwards, anyone can see that we should speak for a long time. And it is worthwhile to adduce also the fact that these men of old who invented names thought it madness was neither shameful nor disgraceful, otherwise they would have not connected the very word mania with the noblest of arts, that which foretells the future, by calling it the monic art. No, they gave this name thinking that mania, when it comes by gift of the gods, is a noble thing. But nowadays people call prophecy the mantic art, tastelessly inserting a tau into the word. The prospective Pythias of Delphi began their training by practicing Dionysiac rites as Theades, showing just how closely related the mania inflicted by the two half-brothers, Apollon and Dionysos, were in the Greek mind. We'll get into the Dionysiac/Bacchic mania in a future video. For now, what we need to know is, 1. Those who practiced these rites received their name from Thea, a nymph who was said to be the first to offer to Dionysos, and 2. Who also bore a child to Apollon named Delphos. This shows the connection between the Dionysiac ecstasies, the nymphs, Apollon, and prophecy extends into the very concept of mania and how it was viewed in Greece in and of itself. Those women who showed the most promise in these rites to potentially enter the state of Enthusiasmos, or divine inspiration and possession. The Enthusiasmos of the Dionysiac revelers was said to manifest in a wild, manic state of frenzied dancing and singing, but that of the Pythia manifested quite differently. She is serene, calm, and calculated in her depictions on vase paintings and in writing, as opposed to the frenzied and twisted depictions of the divinely maddened Bacchants. In the aforementioned video on divination, I mentioned that some ancient authors, including Plato and Cicero, divided divination into the so-called natural divination, mantike et teknos, and directly pitted it against the more rational or taught forms of divination, mantike and teknoi. I think that this is perhaps the wrong approach, as it is clear in how seers were portrayed even in the earliest epics that all require a form of divine inspiration, or epipnoia, to function. A seer of the latter category needed the divine gift of Apollon to recognize omens for what they were, with certainty paired with the skill to interpret them of the learned craft. Even to this day, modern Hellenists typically offer to Apollon or another oracular deity such as Pan or the local nymphs or Hermes before asking their question, requesting his guidance and finding the answer through their chosen tool. But this form of epipnoia is something altogether different from the experience of prophetic mania, where a prophetess or mantis is seized by the gods with a vision of the future or with words spoken directly to the querent regarding their question. These states were not frantic in the way that they're sometimes portrayed in modern times. The priestess at Delphi was said to speak clearly and slowly in ancient times. It was not a frenzied babbling that was interpreted by priests standing by with the express purpose to do so. But it was induced through a combination of training from a young age, environmental stimuli that created a fertile ground for the god to initiate possession, and the opportunity for him to do so in the form of the question asked. Preparations that often left the priestesses mentally and physically exhausted at the end of a session. The strain of giving prophecies was so exhausting for the Pythia that until the 5th century, Delphi only opened once a year as an oracle, on Apollon's birthday. However, as demand grew, on the 7th of 9 of the months of the Greek year, a rotation of 3 priestesses would give prophecies to seekers. Demand continued to rise despite this, and eventually lot oracles and other mantic services emerged in Delphi surrounding the temple to help compensate for the inability of the prophetesses to meet the heightening demand due to the exhaustion that clearly descended upon them after a prophetic session. Other oracles that gave inspired prophecies also had connections to cave and cult sites. Unlike the vapor-producing cavern the priestesses would enter at Delphi, at Claros, the Thespiodos, or inspired singer, would descend alone into a long, winding cavern with at least 7 turns, then take a drink of a sacred spring, which would then allow him to utter a prophecy through inspiration. The connection between sacred springs, nymphs, Apollon, and prophecy is powerful and well attested, and in a future video on the nymphs I'll get deeper into it. But water itself was associated with purification and prophecy both when it came from a sacred source. Typically, querents would be left at the mouth of the cave, but those who had the money to spare could be taken down into the grotto with the Thespiodos. He would sing his song in response in verse after drinking the sacred water, which would then be recorded and potentially interpreted by the prophetis. The staff at the sacred site also included a priest. Of the 3, the Thespiodoi held their positions the longest. As an aside, Aristotle compares the water drinking of the priests at Claros to the drinking of unmixed or undiluted wine by the priest at Dionysos in Thrace when they prophesied. Drinking wine that had not been diluted by water was considered dangerous and potentially toxic in ancient Greece. The temple at Didyma had a similar yet different approach that combined aspects of both the previous oracles. It has only ever been described by Iamblichus, who attributed her prophetic trance to the vapors given off by the sacred spring king, similar to those in the cave at Delphi. The outer courtyard of the temple at Didyma contained a grove of laurel trees. Quirents would stay in the outer courtyard, and the prophetes would descend into this temple sanctum, down the murky passages that led to a prophetic priestess, Dorpomantis, who sat on a pivot or axis called an axon with her clothes touching the water. In a state of mania inspired by Apollon, she would reply in prose or hexameters to the prophetes, who then recorded and carried the answer out to the querent. Preparations for this moment were also fairly strict at Didyma. Iamblichus informs us that the Promantis had to fast for 3 days, stay in the innermost sanctuary during that time prior to opening the oracle to the public, and give numerous sacrifices in a state of utter piety and devotion. Similar fasting was reported at Delphi and Claros, but not for as long. Monic divination wasn't just the experience of a chosen few of Apollon, the nymphs, Pan, and Dionysos, however. There were a few sites where an ordinary querent could experience divine visions and possessions themselves. The most famous and well attested of these is the Trophonium in Boeotia, where we have Pausanias to thank for informing us on the process and experience of visiting there. The preparation for an oracular consultation there was grueling and consisted of preliminary sacrifices, secluded lodging, cold baths, repeated mantic prayers, a specific diet, and complete abstinence. They would then be led by 2 young boys, dubbed Herme, and likely personifying Hermes as a guide of souls, into a massive circular hole, where the querent would lay down and immediately be drawn into another hole as if by a current or eddy. It was thought that Trophonios appeared to inquirers in person at this point, though in one account we have by Plutarch shows that other sorts of visions and out-of-body experiences could be had there as well. Immediately after the experience finished, the querent would sit down in the chair of Mnemosyne, mother of the Musai, whose name means memory, and recount their experiences to the priests. Once this was done, their relatives could take them away. It was thought that the experience was so intense that many lost their ability to smile, birthing the phrase, "he consulted the prophonium," to refer to melancholy. Independent wandering montes of various kinds also existed throughout Greece, and some specific sorts were directly attested as experiencing montic prophecy from the 6th century onward. The most interesting of these were the Sibyls, which began as just one Sibyl in our earliest attestations, but were plural by the 4th century. These priestesses/seers were said to experience visions similar to the ones I described at the beginning of this section. Visions of the future they tried to translate into words gifted by the god whom they gave their total devotion. The male equivalent was the Bacchis, who most frequently devoted himself to Dionysos or was seized by the nymphs. By later antiquity, books of Sibylline and Bacchic prophecies were turned into lot oracles and frequently sold in the markets of Rome. Unlike the oracles at the famous oracular sites, who served directly as a channeling medium for their deities, the Sibylline prophecies retained some of the personhood of the prophet, sometimes even addressing their deities directly. Julia Ustinova, in her monumental work on Mania, draws parallels between the description of the Sibyls in Heraclitus and Aeschylus' Cassandra from Agamemnon, who sees visions that the chorus wonders if they actually come from Apollon or from some kakodaimon, or malicious entity, that she tries to translate into words for the audience. She hovers perpetually between divine inspiration and abject human madness, similarly to how the Sibyls were described and showcasing the toll that consistent exposure to the divine manic state can take on the human mind. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, however, prophetic mania wasn't the only sort of divinely inspired madness that the gods could bless a person with. Poetry and performance has had its own sort of enthusiasmos or mania, one that was clearly linked to that of Apollon. Even Hesiod mentions this in Theogony when discussing the Muses. For it is through the Muses and far-shooting Apollon that there are singers and harpers upon the earth, but the princes are of Zeus, and happy is he whom the Musai love, sweet flows speech from his mouth. Clearly, they were said to play a role in prophecy when delivered in poetic verse, which I've mentioned throughout this section was often the case with monic prophecy. Similar to Apollon's epithet Nymphogetes, mentioned earlier, he shares an epithet with the Musai, Musagetes, leader of the Muses. This makes a great deal of sense, as we'll see. Through the Homeric hymn to Hermes, we see the links between Apollon and the lyre, the most common instrument of archaic age poets performing their odes for the gods. And we've also seen that even the nympholepsy and Panolepsy were said to deliver their prophecies in verse when under the influence of the gods. Of course, the Muses would also have their influence in these states. But what of the mania of the Musai in the context of poetry? Part 2. Inspiration, the mania of the Musai. The Muses have often been called a fickle bunch by modern artists across various artistic fields. Even in antiquity, the relationship between skill, inspiration, and the nebulously defined concept of talent and good old-fashioned hard work was heavily debated. But the fact remains that, even from our oldest sources, the idea that the greatest art could only be created with the direct intervention of the goddesses remains firmly entrenched, and for good reason. Keep in mind, the gods take part in all artistic expression. This is also universally universally true, in my opinion and that of many of the ancients, but there's a distinction between participation and what we'll be talking about in this section. For those who have experienced artistic mania, the seizure of the Muses, there is nothing more beautiful, addictive, or terrible. It is their food, their drink, their sleep, their work, their play, their everything. Unlike similar states like flow state or neurodivergent hyperfocus, the state of Musaic mania can strike at any time and send the artist into a frenzy of obsessive creation, as though their very body is being burned alive from the inside until the work is out. After experiencing the universe on the point of a pin, those who have felt this state and left it feel the loss down to their very bones, as though there is a new hole in the universe that has just been torn open and their lives will never be the same. It has been described, even by modern artists, as a possession of sorts, one that brings out the absolute core of who that artist is while banishing their good nous, their body of knowledge or their mind, to the furthest reaches of consciousness. They are the most themselves they'll ever be, and yet completely taken over by this outside force, stirred into a frenzy, the work itself filling every spare inch of their interior as they feverishly labor to bring it into being. We'll get into some of the eccentricities that this could produce in antiquity, and how sometimes artists seeking the mamic state would mimic it in the hopes of attracting divine attention. Many artists who have been blessed with it form an addiction to the experience, chasing that high and begging the goddesses for that inspiration for the rest of their lives. The oldest poems we have, from Homer and Hesiod, begin with the entreaties, "Sing, O Muse," of the topic at hand. Hesiod in his Theogony gives us the earliest look at ancient beliefs surrounding inspiration, madness, skill, and labor. Unlike Homer, who many in antiquity attributed divine siring to, Hesiod was a poor shepherd who claimed that the Muses gave him his ability to create verse at all. Let's take a look at how he talks about his own experiences to see if we can parse anything about how he sees their role in the crafting of his work. He first addresses the Muses at the beginning of the poem, describing how they sang of all the things to come, then states, "And one day they taught Hesiod glorious song while he was shepherding his lambs under holy Helicon, and this word first the goddesses said to me, the Muses of Olympus, daughters of Zeus who holds the aegis, shepherds of the wilderness, wretched things of shame, mere bellies, we know how to speak many false things as though they were true, but we know when we will to utter true things. So said the ready-voiced daughters of great Zeus, and they plucked and gave me a rod, a shoot of sturdy laurel, a marvelous thing, and breathed into me a divine voice to celebrate things that shall be, and things that were aforetime. They bade me sing of the race of blessed gods that are eternally, but ever to sing of themselves both first and last." Later, after recounting the story of their birth, he also informs us, "These things then, the Muses who dwell on Olympus, 9 daughters begotten by great Zeus, Cleo and Euterpe, Thalia, Melpomene and Terpsichore, Erato and Polyemnia and Urania and Calliope, who is chiefest of them all, for she attends on the worshipful princes, whomever the heaven-nourished princes and the daughters of great Zeus honor, and behold, at his birth they pour sweet dew upon his tongue, and from his lips flow gracious words. All of the people look towards him while he settles causes with true judgments, and he, speaking surely, would soon make a wise end even of a great quarrel. And thereby are the princes wise at heart, for when the people are being misguided in their assembly, they set them right the matter again at ease, persuading them with gentle words. And when he passes through a gathering, they greet him as a god with gentle reverence, and he's conspicuous among the assembled, such as the holy gift of the Muses to men. For it is through the Muses and far-shooting Apollon that there are singers and harpers upon the earth, but princes are of Zeus, and happy is him who the Muses love. Sweet speech flows from his mouth. For although a man has sorrow and grief in his newly troubled soul, and lives in dread because his heart is distressed, yet when a singer, the servant of the Muses, chants the glorious deeds of men and old, and the blessed gods who inhabit Olympus, at once he forgets his heaviness and remembers not his sorrows at all, but the gifts of the goddesses soon turn him away from these." Let's break this down a bit. We see parallels between the words describing nymphs and those describing the Muses here. The Muses inspire poets whose words flow like honey, and whose gifts are like sweet dew on the tongue of the poet. We also get language at the beginning that the Muses taught Hesiod the art of poetry, not just infusing it into him like a mad rave, but actively instructing him so he could build the skill then to make use of the inspiration to come. We also see that the Muses specifically pluck a sturdy staff of laurel, a plant sacred to Apollon and frequently used in offerings surrounding purification, prior to breathing in the voice, the mania of inspiration, into Hesiod that would then create his famous works, Theogony, Works and Days, the Shield of Heracles, and the Catalogue of Women. It is clear that Hesiod sees his work on the Theogony and other poems as directly divinely inspired. The Muses inspired him with truth and taught him how to make use of that truth through the labor of crafting the poems, which as an author, I can assure you, the writing process is significantly more labor-intensive than it looks. Even with divine inspiration, there is still the craft that must be considered in order to bring inspiration to fruition. This is supported further in a fragment from Democritus, preserved by Dio Chrysostom, which he states that Homer, possessed of a divine nature, built a world out of every kind of verse, since it is impossible for beautiful and wise verses to be built in that way without a divine and heaven-sent nature. Without divine inspiration, according to the Greeks, the labor of a poet will not produce verses as beautiful as those that are granted by the Muses in the state of Mania. That does not mean that art produced outside of the state is worthless, simply that the assistance of the Muses pushes humans above and beyond what initially appears to be our capabilities, revealing the truth in stories that may otherwise be inaccessible to us. This idea of the frenzied poet was preserved even all the way into the early days of Plato's Academy, where Plato himself remarks in Ion, "For all the good epic poets utter all those fine poems not from art, but inspired and possessed, and all good lyric poets likewise. It is just as Corybantic worshippers do not dance in their senses, so the lyric poets do not indite those fine songs in their senses, but when they have started on the melody and rhythm, they begin to be frantic, as it is under possession. For the poets tell us, I believe that the songs they bring us are the sweets they cull from honey-drooping founts in certain gardens and glades of the Muses, like the bees winging in the air as they do, for a poet is a white and linged and sacred thing, and is unable to initiate until he is inspired and out of his senses, and the mind no longer is in him. Every man, whilst he retains possession of that, is powerless to indite a verse or chant an oracle. These fine poems are not human or the work of men, but divine in the work of the gods, and that the poets are merely interpreted the gods, according to each is possessed by one of the heavenly powers." Plato echoes here the honey language of Hesiod and the nymphs, curiously also relating poetic inspiration by the Muses with the bee-like qualities of the nymphs from the Homeric hymn to Hermes while he's at it. He describes the frenzy and possession by the work itself through the gods during its performance, which Hesiod described as being breathed into him, as other poets in Theogony, much as Athena was said to have breathed the Menos into the heroes in the Iliad. But the parallels don't end there. He compares them to the Corybantic worshippers, who are also compared frequently to those who excited themselves in Dionysian frenzy, just like the training for the priestesses at Delphi. From the much later Seneca, we get the following on poetic inspiration. "For whether we believe with the Greek poet that sometimes it is a pleasure also to rave, or with Plato that the sane mind knocks in vain at the door of poetry, or with Aristotle that no great poetic genius has ever existed without some touch of madness, be that as it may, the lofty utterance that rises above the attempts of others is impossible unless the mind is excited. When it has scorned the vulgar and the commonplace, and has soared afar aloft by the divine inspiration, then alone it chants a strain too lofty for mortal lips. So long as it is left to itself, it is impossible for it to reach any sublime and difficult height. It must forsake the common track and be driven to frenzy, and champ a bit, and run away with its rider, and rush a height that would have feared to climb by itself." If you remember how the feeling of mania was described at the beginning of my video, the way that the work seems to possess the artist from the outside, the fire that burns under the skin until it is completed, replacing the entirety of the artist's mind with the work itself, because there is no room for anything else. Shirking the mundane here in Seneca echoes back to the line about the laurel staff and purifications performed before divination by the prophets and prophetesses of the oracles. Divine inspiration cannot happen in the presence of the mundane. It is all-consuming and requires a devotion and dedication that is frenzied and obsessive, overwhelming and total. This doesn't in any way discount the knowledge and work that must go into the craft. Someone who has never so much as seen sheet music is going to struggle much more with bringing a fully realized symphony in their minds into the world than someone who spent most of their life dedicated to music theory. It seems from the sources we have and the direct experience of many artists, ancient and contemporary, that cultivating skill for a lifetime creates a fertile field that encourages the gods to plant seeds of monic inspiration. It doesn't guarantee it, nothing does, and sometimes monic inspiration can drive someone to cultivate that very field, as it were, in the hopes of creating a product that consumed them in that inspiration. But largely, those that experience mania seem to be those who also have the dedication to their work required to gain the skill to create that which would be worthy of the inspiration gifted to them. Hesiod even said he was taught by the Muses and then inspired. And at least once in Homer, a great poet is referred to as autodidactos, self-taught. The Muses are also the daughters of Mnemosyne, whose name means memory, and one of the three Titan Musai carried a name that roughly translates to practice. So it's clear that all of these things play an important role in art. There's another interesting parallel in theogony regarding the role of the Musai in poetry and performance, one I haven't seen discussed anywhere else before, but which I would like to draw attention to in this video. If anyone knows of scholars who have mentioned this in the past, please let me know down in the comments. There's another very specific line here in Hesiod's Theogony, one that explains the invocation to the Musai at the beginning and end of all epic poetry, including the Homeric hymns. As I mentioned in my video on offerings, one of the most important aspects of home worship and ritual structures in traditional Hellenism, according to Hesiod and the Homeric hymns, was the invocation of Hestia, who received offerings both first and last. In her Homeric hymn 29, we are told, "Hestia, in the highest dwellings of all, both deathless gods and men who walk on earth, you have gained an everlasting abode and the highest honor. Glorious is your portion and your right, for without you mortals hold no banquet, where one does not duly pour sweet wine in offering to Hestia both first and last." Hestia did not have statues in homes very often, as she herself was seen as manifest through the sacred hearth fire. She, being firstborn among the deathless gods to be consumed by Kronos and last to be released, and forming the connection between humankind and the Theoi by providing the hearth fire that carries the sweet-smelling scent of the offerings to the gods, always received the first and last portion. What's interesting here is that Hesiod also invokes this first and last language in Theogony, referring to the Musai. Why might that be? When I thought about it for more than a moment, the answer became clear. Because as those of you who have seen my video on devotional offerings may know, the poetic performance itself was seen as the offering of the poets to the deathless gods. Callimachus himself mentions this when he states, "We bards always make smokeless offerings." This is an offering without a fire, but when one considers the role of the Musai inspiring poetic performance and its original composition, this invocation makes perfect sense. In a fireless poetic offering, the Musai serve Hestia's role as a conduit to connect the gods and the poet who offers his or her performance to them. The Homeric hymn to Hestia also mentions Hermes, who is a frequent companion to the Musai, and humans overall in his role as messenger, which I would argue means that for modern worshippers doing devotional offerings of crafts to those patron deities of those crafts, Hermes could serve that function during the crafting process, invoked alongside the patron deity of said craft at the beginning and end of a session. This conduit created by the Musai to the gods also enables their blessings to infect the audience with Enthusiasmos, much the same as Hestia's fire conduit, according to our oldest sources, allows the blessings of the offerings at public rituals to be conferred upon the populace that attend through the smoke collectively being carried to the gods. Hesiod is the earliest source that we have mentioning this directly when he says that, "For although man has a sorrow and grief in his newly troubled soul and lives in dread because his heart is distressed, yet when the singer, the servant of the Muses, chants the glorious deeds of men and old and the blessed gods who inhabit Olympus, at once he forgets his heaviness and remembers not his sorrows at all, but the gifts of the goddesses soon turn him away from these." Though Homer alludes to it as well when the shepherd Eumaeus says, "Just as when a man gazes upon a minstrel who sings to mortals songs of longing that the gods have taught him, and their desire to hear him has no end whenever he sings, even so he charmed me when he sat in my hall." Aristotle in Politics also discusses this, when he talks about the ways various musical modes affect people's souls. For any experience that occurs violently in some souls is found in all, though with different degrees of intensity. For example, pity and fear, and also religious excitement. For some folks are very liable to this form of emotion, and under the influence of sacred music we see these people, when they use the tunes that violently arouse the soul, being thrown into a state as if they had received medicinal treatment and taken a purge, the same experience that must then come to also the compassionate and the timid and the other emotional people generally in such a degree as befalls each individual of these classes. All must undergo a purgitation and a pleasant feeling of relief. Similarly, also the purgative melodies afford harmless delight to people. Looking closely at what he's saying here, which will become a bit clearer when we look at the ecstatic purge and mania as an ancient Greek treatment for mental illness generally, Aristotle is saying that people who experience music that is divinely inspired are liable to be seized by a state similarly to the frenzy of those rites, thereby freeing them of their cares as referred to by Hesiod. In other words, ecstatic performances can have a similar purgative effect, in Aristotle's view, to direct ecstatic rites. As per usual, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of the manifold ways that gods interact with us directly and the overwhelming experiences that are left behind from that contact, but I hope that what I've managed to piece together can explain why some artists experience the intensity they do, or why many modern folks may experience direct prophetic divination in the modern day. That's not to say that such claims shouldn't be met with scrutiny at all. To the contrary, anybody who claims special knowledge or a special relationship should definitely be examined closely. But the fact remains that the gods do and always have interacted with humanity in these ways, and for those that have expressed these states, it's a life-changing and overwhelming experience. To ignore and dismiss them as mere cultural artifacts is a desperate and dire loss to the community at large, and a hobbling of the vast variety of the ways the gods have always made their presence known. Though we must be careful always to avoid glorifying mental illness, I do not believe that's what these specific states are, and for those with a severe mental illness who have experienced them, just like with the divine experiences generally, there's a differing quality to these experiences that's hard to quantify yet still exists. There are still several more of these monic states considered to be mostly blessings in ancient times left to cover in future videos. Bacchic and corybantic frenzy, the healing mania of certain oracles of healing, the frenzy of Eros and Aphrodite, the mania of Ares' domain, and the inspiration of the philosopher. I'll be covering these hopefully soon, though there may be a few videos in between depending on when I can get my hands on some of the resources that I need for them. With that said, thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, shout at the subscribe button, prophecies it is not prepared to hear, and let the like record your pleasure as you do so. Drop down into the comments and tell me if you feel you've ever experienced these states, or know folks who have, what they felt like, and which deities you associated them with. I love hearing from you all in the comments, even if I don't always get time to reply. Special thanks also to my patrons. I had to take 2 weeks off at the beginning of April for mental health reasons, and you all were the ones who convinced me to actually do so. Without your support, I never would have been able to afford all of the materials and upkeep costs required to keep this channel running. I rarely have to think twice before picking up a rare monograph or referencing something specific and obscure, and I only hope that the diligence of my research shows that your contributions are going to good use. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.